What do Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have in common? Well, both of them are trying to convince millions of people to vote for them as the President of the United States. What I'm interested in, and what we're going to be diving into in this episode, is how are they doing that? About 25 years ago, I started a master's thesis in psychology where I identified how gurus use stories to be able to position themselves in the mind of the audience in a certain way. And today we're going to do the same thing with these two candidates. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand some of the most important and useful techniques that both of them use in order to be able to be persuasive. In this particular part one of a two-part series, I'm going to dive into rhetorical strategies that they use, as well as how they position themselves and the opposition in the mind of the American public. And in a future episode, I'm then going to dive into how do they leverage the power of storytelling and how they use what we call logical fallacies. This episode is going to be a game changer. And unlike any other analysis of the elections, let's go for it. Hello there and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick, and I should really start with a trigger warning, but there's no point in starting with a trigger warning because by the very nature of the title itself, that should be enough of a trigger. Anytime you mention the term Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, you are going to trigger people, in America at least. And those people will be triggered for a whole host of different reasons. Some of them will be triggered positively. Oh my goodness, I love him. I love her. Others will be triggered negatively. Oh my God, he's the worst. Oh my God, she's the worst. My perspectives are my actual political views. I put them aside. I'm not going into them. Instead, all I want to do is investigate and understand from a changing minds point of view, how do both individuals change minds? What are some of the strategies they use? And in this part one of a two-part series, we're going to look at the rhetorical techniques used by both Harris and Trump. And we're also going to look at how they position themselves and how they position the other person and the other person's supporters as well. So this is going to be a really interesting episode. Once again, please go into this with an open mind, ready to understand, hopefully more than you do currently, about how these people do what they do. We have the follow-up episode coming next week, just in time for the election itself. Don't worry, you're going to get absolutely no guidance from me, but you are going to understand more about how politicians do what they do. So we're going to start and we're going to talk about a number of different rhetorical techniques. Of course, over the last few weeks, we've talked about a number of different rhetorical techniques. So some of these will be familiar. Some of them you will have heard me talk about before, some not so much. But either way, we'll unpack them and I'll give you examples from each of the candidate for all of the different techniques we're going to talk through. And the first one we will go into is ethos. This is what Aristotle talked about in terms of one of the three elements of rhetoric or persuasion. It's the appeal to character. So it's establishing yourself as credible as a character. So I want to give you examples from how both of the candidates leverage ethos. And all of the examples that I'm giving you over the course of this episode, and indeed the follow-up episode, are coming directly from Trump's convention speech in the Republican National Convention earlier in 2024, as well as Harris's convention speech in the Democratic National Convention in 2024. So I've stuck to those because obviously we could go through dozens and dozens and probably hundreds of different speeches by both over the years, but I tried to stick to the two speeches that both candidates made relatively close to each other. So with that in mind, an example from Trump, as in how he positioned himself as credible, how he leveraged his ethos, is he said, "We defeated 100% of ISIS in Syria and Iraq." And that immediately obviously positions him as credible because look how successful we were in terms of destroying this horrible terrorist group. Another example from Trump is on Monday, a major ruling was handed down from a highly respected federal judge in Florida, Aileen Cannon. So once again, he's leveraging the sort of authority of this federal judge to position himself as better as a result. But Kamala Harris does this as well. She gives an example in the convention speech. As Attorney General of California, I took on the big banks, delivered $20 billion for middle-class families who faced foreclosure. So again, she's positioning herself in a way as being someone who is not just fighting for middle-class families, but also demonstrates how she was Attorney General of California, which positions herself as more credible. She also says, as a young courtroom prosecutor in Oakland, California, I stood up for women and children against predators who abused them. So not only is that sort of virtuous, or what we call Arete, which we'll talk about a little bit, it also demonstrates that she has credibility because she was a young courtroom prosecutor in Oakland, California. So once again, Both of these are examples of how Kamala Harris positions herself with Ethos. Getting to Arete. Arete is whenever we demonstrate a sense of moral virtue or excellence, like we're good people and we position ourselves in that way. Trump gives an example where he said, our resolve is unbroken and our purpose is unchanged to deliver a government that serves the American people better than ever before. So in other words, I just want to serve the American people. He's positioned himself as, I just really care about America and I want to serve the American people. Another example from Trump would be, no matter what obstacle comes our way, we will not break, we will not bend. So he positions himself as, we're going to be relentless, we're not going to stop because justice is what we're pursuing. We are pursuing doing the right thing for America. And Harris, she turns around in her convention speech and she says, I'm more determined than ever, and so are you. So is everybody in this room. So she's not only saying, I really care about this, but also all my support. We're all amazing. Together we can do this. And her other example would be, I will never waver in defense of American security and ideals, because in the enduring struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand. And just in case it's confusing for anyone, she's suggesting that she stands on the side of democracy, not tyranny. I mean, I think that's obvious enough. But again, she positions herself with those moral virtues. The next is Phronesis, and this is demonstrating practical wisdom and sound judgment. And this time we'll go to Harris. Harris says, we will create jobs, grow our economy, and lower the cost of everyday needs like healthcare and housing and groceries. So she's making a statement and talk about this is the kind of thing we will do because this is what's necessary. She's demonstrating that kind of sound judgment. She also has, we will provide access to capital for small business owners and entrepreneurs and founders. So she's again promising something that naturally sounds like a great idea. Oh, that sounds wonderful. Not necessarily going into detail, but once again, the actual statement itself definitely has sound judgment attached. Whereas Donald Trump, he said, we're going to turn our nation around and we're going to do it very quickly. Again, making a promise of something that sounds like something that everyone would want. It's sound judgment. He also said, I will end the devastating inflation crisis immediately, bring down interest rates and lower the cost of energy. Nobody's going to turn around and go, oh my God, that's the stupidest thing in the world. To either Trump or Harris, everything they're saying there sounds like great judgment. We then have eunoia. This is whenever we demonstrate goodwill towards the audience. Another example from Harris, on behalf of the people, on behalf of every American, regardless of party, race, gender, or the language your grandmother speaks. She's making a statement to the world, and she's saying everyone's included, and that kind of positions, I have goodwill towards all of you because you're all part of this. And her other example is, I promise to be a president for all Americans, right? And it's like when Obama used to say, you know, red state, we are not red states, we're not blue states, we are the United States of America. Obviously, he had nothing like that type of accent, but you get what I'm trying to say. That's pretty much what he talked about when he was in power, or just before he got elected, actually, that's what he would say. Some examples from Donald Trump. I'm running to be a president for all of America, almost identical to what Harris said. Not half of America, because there's no victory in winning for half of America. Sound judgment there. But again, listen to it. Right? I promise to be a president for all Americans, Harris. I'm running to be a president for all of America, Trump. Okay, same thing. Finally, we have something you both agree on. And then the other thing that Donald Trump says, to all of the forgotten men and women who've been neglected, abandoned, and left behind, you will be forgotten no longer. Again, very powerful, directly targeting the people that feel forgotten or left behind, which I'm sure is a huge sample of the population. So he's speaking to those people and again, demonstrating goodwill there, which is very, very effective. The next is the use of storytelling. On the next episode where we dive in part 2, we'll talk more about the specific techniques. But again, if we look at Trump, he told the story, of course, of the assassination attempt. But an example of his storytelling here would be, he started off and he said, it was a warm, beautiful day in the early evening in Butler Township. I mean, you know, you could open a novel and that would be the first line of the novel. Very sort of descriptive, you know, giving it vivid. And another thing he said, once my clenched fist went up, which is that iconic pose, the crowd realized I was okay and roared with pride. I mean, creating the visual and auditory, he definitely has some great storytelling skills. And meanwhile, Kamala Harris, she would give the story of her mother. She said, my mother was 19 when she crossed the world alone, traveling from India to California with an unshakable dream to be the scientist who would cure breast cancer. Again, that's inspiring, right? It sounds inspiring. And then growing up, we moved a lot. I will always remember that big Mayflower truck packed with all our belongings. The specificity here of both Trump and Harris is very powerful. Both of them telling stories in a very, very effective way. And it's just, you can visualize the big Mayflower truck, just like you can visualize Trump's fist in the air and hear the roar. So both of them excellent examples of storytelling. There's also anaphora, which is repetition at the beginning of clauses when you start the sentence with the same kind of terms. So examples from Harris here would be, we are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back. I mean, that's pretty much repetition rather than anaphora, but it also can count as anaphora. But she again repeats words like that. Trump uses this as well. He says, we will restore patriotism to our schools. We'll restore law and order to our streets. Or he says, we'll unleash the power of American innovation. We'll restore and renovate our nation's once great cities. So again, we will. Repeated quite a lot. So both candidates tend to use anaphora quite a lot. We then have hyperbole. This is exaggeration for effect. We have Harris. We're the heirs to the greatest democracy in the history of the world. Let us write the next great chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told. Again, a little bit, dramatic there. The greatest, most extraordinary story ever told. And then the best at hyperbole, in my opinion, Donald Trump. 4 greatest years in the history of our country and the greatest economy in the history of the world. But if you look at it, I mean, both of them used the history of the world. I think that's, again, very fascinating. So from Harris, we're the heirs to the greatest democracy in the history of the world. And from Trump, the greatest economy in the history of the world, right? History of the world. They're comparing to everything that's ever happened. Every single government that's ever existed, they're comparing. Every economy, they're comparing. And every country. And Trump saying the 4 years with him were the greatest economy in the history of the world. And Kamala is saying we're the heirs to the greatest democracy in the history of the world. So once again, huge amounts of hyperbole used there. We then have contrast. This is where we highlight the differences between what we're saying and what others are saying, or we highlight the differences between two things. So Trump here says, we rise together or we fall apart. You got 2 options. We either rise together by voting for me or we fall apart by voting for her. We had no inflation, soaring incomes. Now nobody can believe what's happening. And that alludes to the fact that it's so bad right now. So it's like, when I was president, it was amazing. When they're now that Joe Biden's president, it's a nightmare. And Harris said, Trump, on the other hand, threatened to abandon NATO. He encouraged Putin to invade our allies. So again, just before that, she talked about all the great progress she'd made, or her and Biden had made. And Trump, on the other hand, threatened to abandon NATO and encouraged Putin to invade our allies. Also, Harris used, instead of a Trump tax hike, we will pass a middle-class tax cut. So again, contrasting her tax cut to a Trump tax hike. And once again, very simplified way of describing what's going on. Another example of a rhetorical technique is appeal to patriotism. And believe it or not, both of them use this. Harris said, we will create what I call an opportunity economy where everyone's the chance to compete and a chance to succeed. Right? So a land of opportunity, America. Or let us show each other in the world who we are and what we stand for. Freedom, opportunity, compassion, dignity, fairness, and endless possibilities. Oh, I feel so inspired. I want to be a more American now as a result of that. Or Donald Trump, together we will lead America to new heights of greatness, right? Because we're already amazingly great, but we can go to even higher heights. We are one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. And again, if you listen to a lot of the speech of both Trump and Harris, they really do talk quite a lot about America and how amazing it is and wonderful. I'm not disagreeing at all. I'm just saying that a big part of their speeches are doing all of that. So these techniques, appeal to patriotism, contrast, hyperbole, anaphora, narrative or storytelling, eunoia, phronesis, arete, as well as ethos, all of these are examples of rhetorical techniques or strategies that both candidates use in order to be as persuasive as possible. And you can probably see, just from what we talked about so far, how similar that they are in terms of how they're using language to be as persuasive as they possibly can be. But I want to turn our attention to another sort of approach to persuading others. And that is how we position ourselves. One of the most intriguing parts of the polarized society that we live in is that we tend to see oftentimes everything gets reduced down to us versus them. So we often have a group, the in group and the out group. There's us and then there's them. There's the goodies and then there's the baddies. And so one of the other things that I wanted to identify and understand is, how does Trump position himself and how does he position the Democrats and Harris in the way in which he uses language? And similarly, how does Harris position herself and how does she position Trump and anyone that allies themselves with him? And so I'm going to walk you through the different ways in which we'll start off with Trump's position of himself in the Republican Party. Then we'll go to Harris's position of herself in the Democrats. And then we'll look at how Trump positions the Democrats and how Harris positions Trump and the Republicans. So we're going to do it in that order. And so first of all, we'll go to, how does Trump position himself and the Republicans? First of all, he presents himself and the Republicans as protectors of the nation. And a good example of this is when he said, I will not let these killers and criminals into our country, obviously talking about immigration. I will keep our sons and daughters safe. We will protect the nation from all of the dangers of immigration. As champions of the common people, that's another way in which Trump positions himself and the Republicans. We are the champions of the common people. The movement has never been about me. It's always about you. It's about your movement. He talks directly to those who are struggling and suffering. And so very much does he emphasize that we're for the common person, the everyday person. We're not for the elites like the others. We're for the common man and woman. Another way in which Trump positions himself and the Republican Party are as restorers of American greatness. Right? Make America great again. I mean, that's a good example. But also, together, we will lead America to new heights of greatness. We've used that already before, like the world has never seen before. So, even though we're going back to it, we're going to do it in a better way than ever before. So, lots of hyperbole there as well, but we're going to restore American greatness. Also, as upholders of traditional values. So Trump talks about how we must not criminalize dissent or demonize political disagreement. I'm the one saving democracy for the people of our country. So once again, he's saying traditional values matter. We must not criminalize dissent or demonize political disagreement. I'm the one saving democracy. So he positions himself as the one saving democracy in that way. So very interesting example there. Now, if we look at how Harris positions herself in the Democratic Party, they are positioned, in her words, as champions of inclusivity and opportunity. For example, she says, on behalf of the people, on behalf of every American, regardless of party, race, gender, or language your grandmother speaks, I gave that example earlier, I promise to be a president for all Americans. You can always trust me to put country above party and self. She's basically saying, everyone's welcome into my group. Also, Harris positions the Democrats as protectors of fundamental rights and justice. So she talks about, I stood up for veterans and students being scammed by big for-profit colleges, for workers who are being cheated out of their wages. So once again, she stood up for them and she'll protect them and she'll protect us as well in the future. She also positions Democrats and herself as leaders of progress and innovation. We will lead the future. We will lead the world into the future on space and artificial intelligence, that America, not China, wins the competition for the 21st century. Again, positioning herself in that way. She also talks about being stewards of democracy and the rule of law. So she talks about, as vice president, I've confronted threats to our security, negotiated with foreign leaders, strengthened our alliances. And also that quote we used earlier, in the enduring struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand and I know where the United States belongs. So once again, we're all for democracy. We hate tyranny. That is pretty much how Harris positions herself and the Democratic Party. But now let's get to the fun stuff. How does Trump position the Democrats and their supporters? Well, he positioned them, first of all, as threats to American safety and prosperity. For example, the current administration terminated every single one of those great Trump policies that I put in place to seal the border. He also positions the Democrats as corrupt and power hungry. If Democrats want to unify our country, they should drop these partisan witch hunts. They used COVID to cheat. Okay. So again, he's positioned himself as corrupt, they cheated, and they're power hungry and power obsessed. He also talks about them as incompetent leaders. Under the current administration, we are indeed a nation in decline. This administration can't come close to solving the problems. He also positions the Democrats as enemies of traditional values and American identity. We have to work on making America great again, not on beating people, and we won. He also positioned the Democrats as destroyers of the economy and society. We have an inflation crisis that is making life unaffordable, ravaging the incomes of working and low-income families. In other words, they don't care about the economy, they're destroying the economy, they're destroying society. And finally, Trump positions Democrats as allies of global threats. They're coming in from every corner of the earth, not just from South America, but from Africa, Asia, the Middle East. Once again, speaking of immigration. And finally, how does Harris position Trump and the Republicans? Number one, as a threat to democracy and justice. Consider his explicit intent to set free violent extremists who assaulted those law enforcement officers at the Capitol, or his intent to jail journalists, political opponents, and anyone he sees as the enemy. Just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrails and how he would use the immense powers of the presidency, right? So it's again, he's a threat to democracy or justice. She also positions Trump and his followers as divisive and self-serving, specifically Trump. Donald Trump is an unserious man, but the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious. He doesn't actually fight for the middle class. Instead, he fights for himself and his billionaire friends. So again, self-serving, divisive, not so good. He also positions Trump and his supporters as regressive and dangerous. But America, we're not going back. We're not going back. We're not going back. He plans to create a national anti-abortion coordinator and force states to report on women's miscarriages and abortions. He threatened to abandon NATO. He encouraged Putin to invade our allies. All ways where they're regressive and dangerous. And then finally, Harris positions Trump as allies of autocrats and dictators. Trump threatened to abandon NATO. I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump. They know Trump won't hold autocrats accountable because he wants to be an autocrat himself. Again, Trump is positioned as an ally of autocrats and dictators, regressive and dangerous, divisive and self-serving, and a threat to democracy and justice, whereas Harris is positioned as an ally of global threats, destroyer of the economy and society, enemies of traditional values and American identity, incompetent, corrupt, power-hungry, and a threat to American safety and prosperity. Now, let's just talk for a second. In the next episode, I'm going to dive into the skills of storytelling used by both Trump and Harris to tell stories. We're also going to look at some of the what we call logical fallacies they both use to be able to persuade the audiences that they talk to. But I think it's obvious enough from what I've just outlined here that an awful lot of the communication that's happening between the parties, and specifically that is happening between Trump and Harris, is nothing got to do with the policies themselves. There's an awful lot of hyperbole. There's an awful lot of attacks on each other's character. There's an awful lot of exaggeration and highlighting and focusing on worst case scenarios and really appealing to fear and appealing to how the world will end if you vote for the other candidate. And I just wanted to draw all of our attention to these particular techniques so that the next time we're listening to anyone speak, we don't automatically listen to exactly what they say and buy into the story. Because both Trump and Harris are giving you two totally different stories about America. And the more that we just believe one story and completely disbelieve the other, the more we fall into the trap of something akin to what we call confirmation bias, where we look for evidence to prove that we're right and we dismiss anything outside of our perspective or point of view. And I think for us all to be more critical thinkers, we need to recognize that there's more than two stories. What we need to do is we need to be able to recognize that sometimes it's about listening to both stories and then making our own mind up. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll understand everything there is to understand, because sometimes the information is so confusing and overwhelming. But it does mean that by understanding how these people are influencing or persuading us or trying to persuade us, we can recognize when it's happening. And if we fall into the trap to think, well, our side is not doing it, but the other side is, then it would be remiss of me if I wasn't to point out that it's happening in both ways on both sides. So I'm not saying either one of the candidates, you should vote for this or you should vote for that. I am going to vote on November 5th in the American election. and I know who I'm going to vote for. But I'm not going to tell you. Instead, I hope that you'll make your own mind up. Not because you just believe in one side or buy into a story, but because you're voting for someone who you believe is going to make a more positive difference to society. But ultimately, I'm hoping that from this episode, you got a lot of things to think about, and you're no longer just going to believe everything one person says and not believe anything the other person says. And instead, hopefully, you'll get a better sense of truly understand what's actually going on in the real world. For now, take care, be well. May the forces always be with you. And may you, whether you live in America or not, see through the political rhetoric and understand a bit more about what's actually going on. And we'll never really know what's actually going on. But maybe, just maybe, we've got a shot when we look at how people are doing it. Bye-bye.